I've asked Pastor Alan Jackson to come because he's in the trenches. Kip Loving, who was on our team with Foundations of Freedom, heard him speak, and he called me and he says, "You got to listen to this." And I heard it, and I was so impacted. I say, he is advancing our message and heart of awakening the voice of truth and using truth directly to come against false narratives, bring about oneness like never before. So, Pastor, won't you come?
Thank you, Dr. Washington. You have a list full of speakers, and I'm not on the list. Aren't you excited? An interloper. I'll take just a moment. We've heard some pretty sobering things today, but I want to make a couple of observations that I think are very good news. We're not the first generation of God's people to wander into the weeds. We're just the latest edition. Our Bibles are filled with that narrative, and the history of the church is filled with that narrative. It's arrogance, and it's escapist theology to say, because we find ourselves in a dark place, it has to be the end of the age. We've taken the truth and the sacrifices that have been made that we could enjoy liberty and freedom, and we've squandered them on comfort and convenience. So the question that's before us is, does our generation have the courage to believe that the gospel is enough? I believe it is. That's the story of Romans 11. That's the story of our New Testament. That's the story, it's the good news we have for the world. The gospel is sufficient. So if you feel overwhelmed, step right up next to Gideon. If you feel like our generation has squandered a great deal, think of the Exodus generation. They walked through the Red Sea, but they didn't make it through the Jordan River, but their kids did. Maybe we can have enough of a change of heart that we can see the generation who follows us achieve something that we don't. I'm pretty certain that the people who waded ashore on Normandy weren't doing that for themselves. Because if your motivation was self-preservation, you'd have never been a part of that landing. So the question is, are we going to be men and women of the kind of courage that we'll make the sacrifices necessary so the generation who comes behind us can have a different future? And the outcome of that's not clear to me just yet, but it's a possibility because that's the story we have. That's the story of the book. So don't be filled with despair. Don't look at the darkness. Find the light and celebrate. Amen. Just two suggestions. Pastors, and I know some of you are here, it's imperative that we tell the truth. It's imperative. I had the privilege of a good education, and I'm qualified to do an exegetically correct presentation. I can see that the hermeneutics are appropriate before I go to the pulpit. And if you give me a few moments, I'll get the homiletical part of it worked out as well. But I can do all of those things and still be completely irrelevant. Do we have the courage to talk about what's happening outside the walls of our worship service or our polite little Bible study? We have to talk about current events. That's not politics. That's not being political. I'm not advocating for candidates or parties. I'm advocating for a worldview that comes from our Bibles. And you can't separate your faith from that worldview. I'm pretty certain John the Baptist could have lived to have been an old man if he wouldn't have talked about current events. You know, it was that dabbling he did in the moral behavior of the king that caused him the trouble. Jesus would have not been nearly as problematic if he hadn't had the audacity to talk about current events. Palm Sunday, the triumphal entry. You can stand on the Mount of Olives today and watch that prophecy fulfilled. He began to weep, and he said, you didn't recognize the time of God's coming to you. Now they're going to dash your babies' heads against the stones of this city. They're going to build a siege ramp against you. You stand there today. The remnants of the Roman siege ramp are still there against the foundation of the Temple Mount. We have to have the courage to talk about what's going on. Now, that's the message to the pastors. But we've heard a lot today about the failures of pastors, 25% with a biblical worldview. It's true. But the pastors aren't going to fix this. Pastors have a role. They have an assignment, a leadership assignment. They're going to be judged by a different standard. I'm not giving them a pass. But I'm telling you, to expect the pastors to be the primary motivators of this is like saying we won't laugh until the comedians do a better job. Laughter begins around our kitchen tables. Laughter begins in the heart of every individual. My Bible says that a merry heart does good like a medicine. Truth in every person's heart. I've served the same congregation for more than 40 years. I helped plant the congregation. That comes with some unique opportunities. Most pastors are employees. They're called to a church that has existed for decades before they arrived. And that formal and informal power structure is very well communicated to them. There's a board, there's a presbytery, there's a group of business people, men and women, that are the founding influence in those congregations. If we want pastors to be more bold, we're going to need business people that are willing to stand with them when they tell the truth. We want the pastors to stand up and say biblical morality is important, that biblical worldviews towards sexuality are important. Well, then we need the business people that are on the boards and the influences in those churches to own that in their world as well. They cannot wink at fornication and adultery and immorality and then ask the pastor to have the courage to take on transgender problems. Our churches are in trouble because in our hearts we're in trouble. Now, the good news is He is a redeeming God, a delivering God, a God who delights in showing mercy even to the wicked. But we don't panic because of Barna's statistics. There's enough people in this room to change the whole direction of this thing. A businessman sent me this invitation. He had been on a board with Dr. Washington, and he asked me if I would take the time to. You have ministered to me today. I'm not disheartened. I'm encouraged. The story we hold is a story that has changed the world over and over and over and over again. And it's going to happen again. I've read the book. But every one of us have a vital role. Don't point your finger at the person not doing their job and say that's the problem. Go find a mirror and speak to the culprit. If you'll address the culprit in the mirror, I believe God will give us an entirely new day. I thank you for what you're doing, for doing this in other cities and speaking to other churches. The Spirit of God is moving in the earth in the most unique way. But we need a courage and a strength in the church that we have not seen for decades. But it's coming back. And I'm honored to be a small part of what God is doing. Thank you, Dr. Washington.